My name is Sadie Jordan. I'm 38 years old, and until recently, I was the quiet one in a very loud family. I live, or lived, in a modest brick house just outside Columbus, Ohio. I'm a project coordinator by profession, the kind of job that requires organization, patience, and the ability to hold multiple moving pieces together without anyone noticing the effort. That description fits more than just my career. If you met me at a family gathering, you probably wouldn't remember much about me afterward. I'm not the one telling the biggest stories. I'm not the one arguing politics across the dinner table. I'm not the dramatic sibling who commands attention just by walking into the room. I'm the one refilling drinks, washing dishes, listening more than speaking. People often mistake quiet for passive, steady for simple, calm for compliant. My parents certainly did. In my family, I was known as the reasonable one, the dependable one, the one who wouldn't make things difficult. And for most of my life, I wore that identity like a coat that didn't quite fit, but kept me warm enough to survive. This story isn't about shouting matches or explosive betrayals. It isn't about revenge. There are no slammed doors, no courtroom battles, no cinematic speeches delivered across polished dining tables. It's about something far quieter. It's about what happens when you realize that being the stable one often means being the one expected to sacrifice. It's about the day my parents pressured me to sell my only home, the house I worked for, saved for, renovated room by room with my own hands, so the money could be divided fairly among my siblings. It's about how the word fairness can be used as a weapon when it ignores effort. And it's about the moment I chose not to argue, not to fight, not to convince anyone of my worth. Instead, I chose to walk away. I cut off my entire family after my parents forced me to sell my only home to divide the money among my siblings. But that sentence, as heavy as it sounds, doesn't tell you how we got there. It doesn't show you the years of subtle dismissals, the small concessions, the normalized expectations that built up quietly, brick by brick, long before the house was ever on the table. This is not a story of anger. It's a story of clarity. There's a difference. For a long time, I believed that love meant cooperation, that loyalty meant flexibility, that being a good daughter meant adjusting my life so everyone else felt comfortable. But there comes a point, sometimes slowly, sometimes all at once, when you look at your reflection and realize you've been slowly disappearing. This is the story of how I stopped disappearing. I won't paint my parents as villains. They aren't monsters. They are complicated people shaped by their own fears and biases. My siblings aren't evil either. They simply grew comfortable in a system that benefited them. And I allowed it. Until I didn't. What unfolded after I refused to continue playing my assigned role was not dramatic. It was quiet, legal, measured, final. By the end, there were no screaming matches, just distance and peace. If you've ever been the reliable one, the strong one, the one everyone assumes will bend because you always have you ever wondered what would happen if you simply stopped? If you asked my parents to describe me, they would say I've always been low maintenance. They would say it with a smile, like it was a compliment. Sadie doesn't ask for much. Sadie's easy. Sadie understands. In a family of 5 children, I was the third, perfectly positioned to become adaptable. Not the responsible eldest who carried the banner of achievement. Not the fragile youngest who needed protecting. Not even the dramatic middle who fought for attention. I was the quiet bridge, the neutral ground. When my older brother argued with my father about career choices, I was the one who listened to both sides afterward. When my younger sister needed help moving apartments for the third time in 2 years, I was the one with the SUV and a free Saturday. When holidays became tense because someone brought up money or inheritance or who got what, I was the one who changed the subject. I wasn't invisible. Not exactly. I was useful, and usefulness, I learned early, was safer than being complicated. Growing up, my achievements were acknowledged, but never centered. If I brought home straight A's, my mother would nod proudly and then turn to help my brother with his math homework. If I won a small scholarship in college, my father would say, "That's great, honey. See? Hard work pays off," before reminding my sister she should apply for more aid too. Nothing cruel, nothing sharp, just diluted. I don't remember ever being told I was difficult. But I also don't remember being asked what I wanted when it conflicted with someone else's need. When I bought my house at 32, it was the first time something in my life felt fully mine. It wasn't large. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a narrow kitchen with outdated cabinets. I painted myself over 2 long weekends. The backyard sloped slightly, and the fence leaned on one side until I reinforced it. I saved for 5 years for the down payment. I skipped vacations, drove the same car long after it stopped being impressive. When I handed over the cashier's check at closing, my hands trembled. Not because I was afraid, because I had done it alone. My parents congratulated me, of course. My mother called it smart. My father said, "Real estate is always a good investment." Investment. That word lingered. To me, the house wasn't an investment. It was stability. It was proof that I could build something solid without leaning on anyone. But over time, I began to notice how they referenced it. When my younger brother struggled with credit card debt, my mother once joked, "Well, at least one of you is sitting on property." When my sister went through her divorce and moved back into our parents' house temporarily, my father said during Sunday dinner, "Sadie's the only one with real equity right now." He said it lightly, almost proudly. I laughed along because that's what I did. In their eyes, I was secure. I didn't need help. I wasn't at risk. I didn't require extra cushioning. My steadiness became justification for redistributing concern elsewhere. And slowly, without anyone explicitly stating it, my house became something else in their narrative. Not just my home, but a resource, a safety net, a piece on the family chessboard. I didn't see it clearly at first. I thought their comments were harmless observations. I told myself I was imagining the undertone. After all, what kind of daughter assumes her parents are calculating her assets? So I stayed what I had always been: reasonable, accommodating, low maintenance. I didn't realize that being the one who doesn't need much often means being the one people feel safest taking from. I wasn't unloved, but I was pre-assigned, and the role was already waiting for me long before the request was ever spoken aloud. The first time my house stopped being mine in their language, it didn't sound like a demand. It sounded like a suggestion wrapped in concern. It was a Sunday afternoon, the kind that stretches lazily after a heavy lunch. My sister Lauren had been living back at my parents' place for almost 6 months after her divorce. My younger brother, Caleb, had just lost another job. Toxic management, he said. My older brother, Daniel, was doing fine financially but constantly investing in new ventures that never quite stabilized. I remember drying a plate in the kitchen when my father walked in behind me. He leaned against the counter, casual, calculated casual, though I didn't recognize it at the time. You know, he said, the market's really strong right now. I nodded. Yeah, I've seen that. You could probably sell that house for a good profit. I smiled politely. I'm not selling. He shrugged. Just saying, it's smart to move when timing's good. I thought that was the end of it. But it wasn't about timing, it was about positioning. Later that afternoon, everyone gathered in the living room. Lauren was venting about how hard it was to start over at 35. Caleb talked about rent being a trap. Daniel discussed an investment opportunity he almost secured, but needed liquid flexibility for. And then my mother said it. Well, Sadie's in the strongest position out of all of you. There was no accusation in her tone, just assessment. Four heads turned toward me. I laughed lightly. Strongest how? You've got property, Daniel said. That's leverage. Leverage. The word landed differently this time. I've got a mortgage, I corrected. Yeah, but equity, Caleb added. That's basically money sitting there. Money sitting there. I remember feeling something small shift in my chest. Not anger, not even fear, just awareness. I wasn't part of the struggling group in that room. I was adjacent to it, observing it, representing stability. And stability, in a family dynamic like ours, meant capacity. Capacity to absorb. My mother reached for my hand. No one's saying you have to do anything, sweetheart. But sometimes, families help each other rebalance when things get uneven. Rebalance. The language was careful, gentle, morally framed. I nodded because that's what I had always done when conversations drifted into uncomfortable territory. I told myself they were brainstorming, that no one was seriously suggesting I sacrifice my home. But something subtle had already happened. The idea had been spoken aloud, and once an idea enters a room, it doesn't leave quietly. Over the next few weeks, the comments became more frequent, but never direct. Interest rates might rise next year. Better to cash out early. You don't even use the second bedroom. Imagine what that kind of liquidity could do for the family. The word family was always emphasized gently, as if resisting the suggestion would imply resisting them. I began to notice how my accomplishments were reframed. My discipline became an opportunity. My restraint became excessive. My security became imbalanced. No one said, sell your house so we can divide the money. Not yet. Instead, they planted seeds of moral responsibility. I started questioning myself. Was I being selfish for holding on to it? Did fairness mean sharing growth? Had I benefited from timing while they'd faced setbacks? I lay awake one night, staring at the ceiling in my bedroom. The bedroom I had painted a muted sage green after saving up for new supplies. I ran my fingers along the brass house key on my nightstand. This house wasn't luck, it was skipped trips, overtime hours, quiet weekends, budget spreadsheets, saying no when others said yes. But doubt is persuasive when it wears the face of love. At the next family dinner, Caleb joked, guess we know who the favorite is. Sadie got the real estate gene. Everyone laughed. I did too. That was the first small cut, not the suggestion itself, but the normalization of the idea that what I had built was somehow communal, that my independence was a shared asset, that my security was negotiable. And the most unsettling part, no one in that room believed they were crossing a line, including me, because I had spent my entire life being the one who understood. And understanding can become self-betrayal if you're not careful. That afternoon in the kitchen was the moment the conversation shifted from admiration to entitlement. Quietly, politely, strategically, and I still told myself it was nothing. After that Sunday, the comments stopped feeling accidental. They became patterned, not aggressive, not loud, just steady, like a drip you don't notice until the ceiling stains. My mother started sending me real estate articles. Just something to think about, she'd text. Market peak predictions. Why smart homeowners cash out at the right time. Always framed as helpful information, never pressure. My father shifted his tone too. Instead of admiring my independence, he began speaking about it as flexibility. You're the only one not tied down, he said one evening when I stopped by after work. No kids, no spouse. You've got mobility. Mobility. I lived in the same house for 6 years. I planted rose bushes along the fence. I memorized which stair creaked and how the light fell across the kitchen counter at 4 p.m. in winter. Mobility was not how I experienced my life. But I didn't correct him, because technically he wasn't wrong. And that's how normalization works. It hides inside partial truth. Lauren began asking casual questions that felt like research. What's your interest rate again? How much equity do you think you've built? If you sold, would you rent or buy again? Each question was delivered lightly, like curiosity. But I started noticing how no one asked Daniel about his savings or Caleb about his spending habits. My house was open for discussion. Their decisions were personal. I rationalized it. They were stressed. Divorce, job loss, financial instability. It made sense they'd look toward the most stable person in the room. And that was me. One night, I was washing dishes at my own kitchen sink when my phone buzzed. A group text. Dad, we should all sit down soon and talk about long-term planning. Mom, yes, it's important for fairness later. Daniel, agreed. Lauren, about time we have that conversation. Caleb, especially since some of us are positioned better than others. Positioned. It was subtle, but no one clarified what positioned meant. They didn't have to. I felt the weight of it alone in my quiet kitchen. That was the first time I didn't respond immediately. Usually, I smoothed things over. I offered practicality. I asked for clarification. I brought balance. Instead, I placed my phone face down on the counter and stared at the wall. Because something inside me was beginning to recognize a pattern. Every conversation about family fairness orbited one asset, mine, and I had never volunteered it. Over the next month, the language sharpened, still polite but firmer. It wouldn't be forever, my mother said over coffee. You could downsize, simplify. You don't need that much space, Caleb added once. It's inefficient. Daniel framed it as a strategy. Look, if the money were redistributed now, we could all stabilize. That benefits everyone, including you, including me. I remember blinking slowly when he said that. How would it benefit me? I asked calmly. Well, he hesitated. You'd have family on equal footing. Equal footing. The assumption buried inside that phrase was almost elegant. My stability had disrupted balance, and the balance required correction. I began questioning my own reactions. Was I overthinking? Were they just brainstorming options? Families talk about money all the time. But the difference is this. In healthy conversations, consent is assumed. Here, expectation was forming. I noticed how often my parents praised my maturity in the same breath as implying sacrifice. You've always been the strong one. You're not like the others. You understand. You're practical. You see the bigger picture. Those compliments started to feel like conditioning because the bigger picture always required something from me, never from them. I didn't explode. I didn't confront. Instead, I did what I had always done. I stayed calm. I nodded. I said, I'll think about it. And in private, I opened a spreadsheet, not because I planned to sell, but because I needed clarity. I calculated my mortgage balance, market value, potential capital gains tax, closing costs, realtor fees, rental averages in my area. I ran scenarios. If I sold and divided profits evenly among 5 siblings, what would I walk away with? Less than half of what I'd built. And no property. And no guarantee of stability if the market shifts. Meanwhile, my siblings would receive liquidity without responsibility. I stared at the numbers late one night and felt something unfamiliar. Not anger, not fear, disillusionment. The normalization of disrespect doesn't feel dramatic when it's happening. It feels rational. It feels like cooperation. It feels like maturity. Until one day you realize you're the only one adjusting, and everyone else has quietly accepted that you will. I was still being invited to dinners, still hugged goodbye, still called sweetheart. But beneath the warmth was an assumption that I would eventually comply, because I always had. And that was the moment I understood something quietly devastating. They weren't asking if I would sell, they were waiting for me to accept that I should. It didn't happen in a single sentence. No one gathered me into a room and said, Sadie, this is your role now. Roles in families rarely arrive with announcements. They're shaped slowly through repetition, reward, and relief. I began to see it clearly during a Sunday dinner in early spring. Lauren was frustrated about child support delays. Caleb was behind on rent again. Daniel had tied up most of his savings in a business expansion that was about to pay off. My parents listened with the same familiar expressions, concern layered over quiet exhaustion. And then my mother looked at me, not dramatically, not even pointedly, just expectantly. I hadn't spoken. I hadn't offered anything. But the silence felt like a cue. Well, I said carefully, there are options: budget restructuring, debt consolidation, maybe short term rentals for extra income. My father waved a hand gently. They're doing what they can. And then, softer, you're the one in a position to make a meaningful difference. There it was. Not an accusation, an assignment, a meaningful difference. In that moment, I understood something I hadn't fully articulated before. I wasn't being viewed as a sibling. I was being viewed as infrastructure, stable, load bearing, reliable. In every past crisis, I had absorbed inconvenience quietly. When Lauren needed a place to stay for 2 weeks after her separation, I rearranged my guest room. When Caleb needed a co-signer years ago, I declined, but helped him research alternatives for hours. When my parents needed help organizing their retirement paperwork, I spent weekends creating folders and spreadsheets. I was the one who figured things out. And somewhere along the way, that competence became communal property. That night, as dishes clinked and conversation drifted back to safer topics, I watched my family differently. Daniel leaned back comfortably, confident that solutions would surface. Caleb scrolled through his phone, detached but unconcerned. Lawrence sighed dramatically, but not with panic, more with expectation. And my parents, they looked tired, but they also looked certain that I would be the one to ease the imbalance. I drove home in silence, the steering wheel steady under my hands. My house greeted me the way it always did, porch light casting a soft glow, the faint scent of lavender cleaner from the morning's chores. I stood in the entryway longer than usual. For the first time, I didn't see just walls and furniture. I saw what they saw: equity, liquid potential, solution, and I saw the role more clearly than ever. I was the reliable one who didn't need much, the one without children, the one without chaos, the one who could afford to sacrifice. It's fascinating how easily sacrifice gets attached to the person who protests the least. Over the next few weeks, The conversations shifted from hypothetical to structured. Dad, if you sold at current value, Daniel, after fees, you'd still clear a strong margin. Mom, and we could divide it evenly. That's what fairness looks like. Evenly. That word kept resurfacing. Evenly assumes equal contribution, equal investment, equal risk. But this wasn't a shared inheritance. This was my mortgage, my savings. My weekends are spent painting walls and repairing gutters. Still, every time I felt the urge to defend myself, another voice inside whispered, "You're stronger than this. You don't need the house. They need stability. You'll land on your feet." Strength can become a trap when it's constantly used to justify why you should give more. One evening, my mother called me privately. "You know we're not trying to hurt you," she said gently. "But sometimes, the child who's blessed is the one who carries more responsibility." Blessed. I stared at the brass house key in my hand as she spoke. Blessed, in this context, meant indebted. I asked her quietly, "Would you ask Daniel to sell his business if I was struggling?" There was a pause. That's different. Of course it was. His ambition was seen as growth. My stability was seen as surplus. That was the role. I wasn't the achiever whose success needed protection. I was the steady one whose foundation could be redistributed. The realization didn't make me angry. It made me still. Because roles are powerful only if you continue performing them. And for the first time in my life, I began wondering what would happen if I stepped off the stage entirely. Not with drama, not with confrontation, but with absence. I went to bed that night with a strange sense of clarity settling over me. They weren't malicious, they were consistent. And I had been consistent too. I had trained them to believe I would absorb the weight. Now, the question wasn't whether they would keep asking, the question was whether I would keep agreeing. It didn't happen during an argument. There was no raised voice, no dramatic ultimatum, no slammed doors. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon in my own living room. I had taken the day off work to wait for a contractor to give me an estimate on replacing the aging windows. The frames were drafty in winter. I'd been saving for the upgrade for almost a year. I remember sitting on the floor with a legal pad, writing down measurements and cost projections. I liked seeing numbers clearly. They felt honest, contained. My phone buzzed. A text from Daniel. We talked again. "Mom and Dad think it makes the most sense if you list the house before summer. Market's strongest then. Not if you decide. Not, have you thought more about it? Just logistics." I stared at the message for a long time. A few minutes later, another text. "Lauren. It would honestly change everything for the kids and me. I hope you know how much this could help." And then Caleb. We'd all finally be on equal footing. Equal footing. That phrase again. I didn't respond. Instead, I looked around my living room. The couch I bought second-hand and reupholstered myself. The bookshelf Daniel had once mocked as too minimalist. The small scratch on the hardwood floor from when I moved the dining table alone because no one was available to help. Every corner of that house had effort in it. Not glamorous effort, quiet effort. I walked into the kitchen and ran my hand along the counter edge. I remembered the day I stood in that same spot after closing. Keys in hand, heart pounding, not from fear, but from pride. No one else had signed those papers. No one else had skipped vacations. No one else had lived on strict budgets for 5 years to make it happen. And yet somehow, the narrative had shifted. My success was a communal opportunity. Their struggles were individual misfortunes. That afternoon, something inside me became very still, not reactive, still. I opened my laptop, not to browse listings, but to review my original purchase documents. I read through the closing statement, the mortgage terms, the amortization schedule. Then I opened a separate document. I titled it Reality. Under it, I wrote three questions. If I sell, what do I gain? If I sell, what do I lose? If I don't sell, what happens? I answered honestly. If I sell, I gain temporary approval. I gain the image of fairness. I gain relief from their pressure. If I sell, I lose stability. I lose leverage. I lose the physical space that represents years of discipline. If I don't sell, I lose what? Silence, approval, access. That was the first time I saw the true cost laid out clearly. They weren't asking me to share. They were asking me to trade long term security for short term harmony. And the harmony wasn't even guaranteed. I realized something else too. If I complied, the role would solidify permanently. Every future imbalance would circle back to me because I had proven I would redistribute myself to maintain peace. I sat back against the couch and closed my eyes. For most of my life, I had equated love with flexibility. But flexibility without boundaries becomes erosion. And erosion is slow, invisible, hard to notice until the structure weakens. That day, I didn't feel anger toward my siblings. I felt clarity about myself. I had been proud of being the easy one, the stable one, the strong one. But strength without self protection isn't strength, it's exposure. The contractor knocked on the door then, startling me slightly. I stood, smoothed my sweater, and let him in. We walked from room to room discussing window dimensions and insulation. When he left, I stood alone in the quiet house again, and I knew something had shifted. Not in them, in me. For the first time, I wasn't asking how to make everyone comfortable. I was asking what would happen if I stopped participating in the negotiation entirely. Not arguing, not persuading, not defending. Just removing myself from the equation. The idea felt radical and peaceful. I picked up my phone and typed one message into the family group chat. I need time to think. Please don't discuss my house without me. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't defiant. But it was the first boundary I had drawn without cushioning it in apology. The responses came quickly. Confusion, reassurance, gentle insistence that we're just trying to plan. I didn't engage further. Instead, I placed my phone face down again. And for the first time in months, I didn't feel small. I felt anchored because the decision was no longer about whether I loved my family enough. It was about whether I loved myself enough to stop dissolving. That Tuesday afternoon, sitting on my living room floor with numbers spread out in front of me, I understood something quietly powerful. They were negotiating assets. I was deciding on identity. And once identity shifts, the rest follows. After that Tuesday, I didn't argue. I didn't defend. I didn't present spreadsheets or emotional appeals or carefully structured counterpoints the way I normally would. I simply stopped participating in the discussion. At first, they mistook it for hesitation. Dad called 2 days later. Have you had time to run the numbers? I'm considering my options, I said evenly. That's good, he replied. We just don't want you to miss the window. The window. It was interesting how urgent my timeline became when it served their needs. I understand, I said. And I meant it. I understood exactly what was happening. Lauren texted me late one night. I hope you're not pulling away from us. We're just trying to be fair. I read the message. I didn't respond. That was new for me. Normally, I would have reassured her, explained my silence, smoothed the edges of her anxiety. But I realized something uncomfortable. My reassurance had always been the fuel that kept the conversation alive. So I let it sit. Silence. When you've always been the mediator, feels unnatural at first. It itches. You want to fill it. You want to prevent misunderstanding. But I began to see silence differently, not as avoidance, as information. In the following weeks, the tone around me shifted subtly. Caleb joked less when I entered a room. Daniel became more formal in his language. My mother started overcompensating with sweetness. Whatever you decide, we love you, she said one evening, her voice almost too careful. That sentence told me everything. It implied that love was now conditional on a decision. No one said it directly, but it hung there. At family dinners, conversations about money would begin and then stall when I didn't contribute. My father would glance at me, waiting for analysis or compromise. I offered neither. I listened and I observed. It's fascinating what people reveal when you stop playing your assigned role. Without my mediation, tensions between my siblings became more visible. Daniel criticized Caleb's spending habits openly. Lauren snapped at Daniel about his investments. My parents' patience thinned. For years, I had buffered these interactions. I had absorbed the emotional overflow. Now I wasn't, and the imbalance they wanted me to correct began surfacing in other places. One Sunday, Daniel finally addressed it directly. "You've been quiet lately," he said across the dinner table. "I've been thinking," I replied. "About what?" Caleb asked. "About what's mine," I said calmly. The table went still, not hostile, just unsettled. Dad cleared his throat. "No one's taking anything from you." I met his eyes. I know. And I did know. That was the complexity. They weren't planning to break in and force a sale. They weren't villains in a courtroom drama. They were leveraging expectation. They believed moral pressure was enough. And for most of my life, it had been. After that dinner, my mother called again. "I feel like you're shutting us out," she said softly. "I'm not shutting you out," I replied. "I'm just not discussing my house anymore." There was a long pause. "But we're family." "Yes, and families share." "Sometimes," I said. Silence stretched between us. Not angry, just heavy. In that pause, I realized something important. They were uncomfortable, not because I had refused, but because I had stopped negotiating. Negotiation allows room for persuasion, for softening, for eventual compliance. Finality does not. And I was moving closer to finality internally, even if I hadn't spoken it yet. Over the next month, I made no announcements. I attended fewer dinners, citing work. I answered calls selectively. I redirected conversations that veered toward planning. Outwardly, I appeared calm, perhaps even detached. Internally, I was evaluating everything. If I complied, I would reinforce a pattern that would never end. If I resisted openly, the conflict would escalate. But if I moved quietly, strategically, I could exit the dynamic entirely. That idea began forming slowly. Not revenge, not punishment. Exit. Silence became less about withholding and more about preparation. I started reviewing legal documents again, researching options, reading about property rights and financial separation. Not because I was panicking, because I was positioning. They mistook my quiet for indecision. It wasn't. It was clarity consolidating. There's something powerful about withdrawing emotional labor, about no longer cushioning everyone else's discomfort. When you stop explaining yourself, people are forced to confront their assumptions. And my family was beginning to feel that shift. They didn't know what I would do. Neither did I, fully. But I knew this. The version of me who would sacrifice automatically was gone. And she wasn't coming back. The interesting thing about being underestimated is that people stop watching you closely. They assume you'll behave the way you always have, predictable, reasonable, available. So when you begin preparing quietly, they don't see it. They think you're still thinking. I wasn't thinking anymore. I was documenting. The first thing I did was request a full property valuation, privately. not through the realtor my father's friend recommended. I chose someone unaffiliated, neutral. The numbers came back higher than I expected. Not life changing money, but enough to make their proposal tempting in the abstract. That was important. I needed to understand the scale of what they were asking for, not emotionally, but concretely. Next, I scheduled a consultation with a real estate attorney. I didn't tell anyone. I framed it as hypothetical estate planning when I booked the appointment, which technically it was. I wanted to know what would happen if I sold. What would happen if I transferred ownership? What protections existed? What vulnerabilities I hadn't considered? The attorney, a woman in her early 50s with sharp eyes and very little patience for emotional storytelling, asked me one simple question. Do you want to sell? I paused. No. She nodded once. Then why are we discussing it? It was almost embarrassing how quickly my chest tightened. Family pressure, I said. She didn't react. Pressure isn't a legal obligation. That sentence rearranged something in me. Pressure isn't a legal obligation. I asked about asset protection, about trusts, about what would happen if I were to, say, reduce contact with relatives who felt entitled to my property. She explained my rights calmly, clearly. The house was solely in my name, no co-signers, no shared inheritance, no liens. It was mine, legally uncomplicated, emotionally entangled. I left her office with a folder of documents and something else. Confirmation. They had no claim, only expectation. After that, I began preparing in ways no one would notice. I updated my will. I removed certain emergency contacts and replaced them with a close friend from work, Mara. Someone who had known me long enough to see through my easygoing exterior. I opened a separate high-yield savings account and began moving discretionary funds into it. Not hiding money, just diversifying access. I scanned and digitized every property-related document. I changed the passcodes on my security system. None of this was dramatic. None of it signaled hostility. It was infrastructure. If they saw me during that time, I appeared unchanged. I still attended occasional dinners. I still asked about Lauren's kids. I still congratulated Daniel on small wins. But I no longer volunteered solutions. I no longer feel silence. And I no longer revealed my thinking process. The more I withdrew strategically, the more they tried to re-engage the old dynamic. Daniel invited me for coffee. Just us. He framed it as a heart-to-heart. You've always been the practical one, he said, stirring his drink. We're not trying to take advantage of you. I nodded. I know. Then why does it feel like you're pulling away? Because I am, I thought. Aloud, I said, I'm just reassessing things. He leaned back, studying me like he was trying to recalibrate. That's when I realized something subtle but important. They weren't used to me being opaque. For years, my transparency had been their reassurance. They always knew where I stood, what I was thinking, how I would likely respond. Now they didn't, and uncertainty makes people uneasy. At home, I began decluttering, not to stage the house for sale, but to detach emotionally from the idea that it defined me. I loved my home, but I needed to know I could survive without it. Because the decision forming in my mind was larger than real estate. It was about severance. I researched housing markets in other cities quietly. Not because I wanted to flee impulsively, but because I wanted options. Options are power. And for the first time, I was building power that wasn't visible. My family thought the leverage conversation was about money. They never considered that I was calculating something else entirely. What would it look like to remove myself from the system altogether? No more redistribution, no more expectation, no more role. That idea stopped feeling frightening. It started feeling clean. One evening, as I locked my front door, I held the brass key in my palm and realized something with startling clarity. The house wasn't my only asset. My distance could be too. And distance, once established, is very difficult to negotiate away. They were watching the market. I was redesigning my life. Quietly, strategically, irreversibly. The real leverage didn't come from the appraisal. It didn't come from the attorney's reassurance. It came from a realization so simple, it almost felt obvious in hindsight. I didn't have to choose between selling the house and keeping the peace. I could remove myself from the equation entirely. The idea surfaced late one evening while I was reviewing my monthly budget. I had built my life to be lean by design. My mortgage was manageable. My expenses were controlled. I had no dependents, no shared debt. For years, I thought that made me vulnerable in family dynamics. In reality, it made me free. I opened a blank document and wrote one sentence at the top. What happens if I stop being available? Not unavailable in a dramatic way, not disappearing overnight, just unavailable for negotiation. I ran the scenario calmly. If I refused to sell, they would escalate emotional pressure. If I sold and divided the profits, the expectation would repeat in future crises. But if I stepped back, financially and relationally, the leverage dissolved. Because their strategy relied on proximity, on access, on my consistent presence at the table. Without that, the argument lost momentum. I began researching something I had never seriously considered before: relocation. Not across the country in a panic, not impulsively, strategically. I looked at cities where my company had satellite offices, places with comparable housing markets. I calculated what it would cost to rent temporarily while deciding on my next move. I wasn't running, I was repositioning, and that distinction mattered deeply to me. The private reveal wasn't that I had power over them, it was that I had options outside of them. For most of my life, I had unconsciously treated family as the center of gravity. All major decisions orbited around maintaining that bond. Now, for the first time, I was imagining a life that didn't require their approval. It was disorienting and oddly peaceful. I scheduled another meeting with the attorney, this time to ask about something specific. If I choose to sell, I said carefully, do I have any obligation to disclose how I use the proceeds? She looked at me evenly. No, no obligation to distribute? None. The room felt very quiet, even if the family expects it. Expectation isn't entitlement. There it was again. Clear, unemotional, legal. Expectation isn't entitlement. I realized then that the narrative in my family had blurred those lines intentionally. They had wrapped expectation in moral language: fairness, balance, support. But legally, ethically, structurally, the house was mine. If I sold it, the proceeds were mine. And if I chose not to involve them in that decision, there was nothing they could do about it. That was the leverage, not the equity. Autonomy. I drove home slowly that afternoon, watching the late sun settle across the neighborhood. The brick houses looked identical from the street, but I knew the interiors were different. Different lives, different boundaries. I parked in my driveway and didn't get out right away. I pictured two futures. In one, I complied. I sold the house under the banner of fairness. I distributed the money evenly. My parents praised my generosity. My siblings expressed gratitude, briefly. And then life continued. New imbalances would arise, new needs, new emergencies. I would remain the stable one. In the other future, I refused the premise entirely. Maybe I sold, maybe I didn't. But either way, I did not negotiate access to my life based on their comfort. There would be fallout, distance, accusations of selfishness, but there would also be something else: finality. That evening, I took the brass key off its leather keychain and placed it on the kitchen counter. I looked at it for a long time. The house had become symbolic in their eyes. In mine, it was simply property. What I was truly protecting wasn't the building, it was the boundary. The private reveal wasn't triumphant, it was sobering, because once you understand you have autonomy, you can't unknow it. And once you accept that you may lose people for using it, the decision becomes clearer. I picked up my phone and opened the family group chat. Dozens of small messages, planning discussions, subtle nudges. I didn't respond. Instead, I drafted a separate message, not yet to send, just to see the words written clearly. I will not be selling my home to redistribute money. This conversation is closed. Reading it, I felt no anger, only steadiness. For the first time, I wasn't calculating how to minimize discomfort. I was calculating exit points. They believed the leverage was financial. They never realized the real shift had already happened quietly, internally. I no longer needed their agreement to feel whole. And that changed everything. Clarity is quiet. It doesn't arrive with adrenaline. It doesn't demand applause. It simply settles in your chest and refuses to move. By the time I reached the decision point, there was no chaos inside me. Just options laid out cleanly, like documents on a desk. Option 1: sell the house, divide the money, remain the dependable daughter, maintain proximity, preserve the image of fairness. Option 2: keep the house, endure escalating pressure, continue negotiating boundaries every holiday, every crisis, every family planning conversation. Option 3: remove myself from the system entirely. That last option had once felt extreme. Now it felt honest. I spent an entire Saturday morning at my dining table with a notebook, writing without censorship. If I cut contact, what would I lose? Sunday dinners, group texts, shared holidays, access to my nieces and nephews, the comfort of being the good one. If I didn't cut contact, I would lose something slowly: authority over my own life, peace in my own home, the right to build without redistribution. I noticed something important as I wrote. Every fear on the first list was emotional. Every fear on the second was structural. Emotional pain fades. Structural compromise compounds. That distinction mattered. I called Mara that afternoon. She had listened quietly through months of updates without inserting judgment. "What would you do?" I asked her. She paused carefully. "Are you asking what I would do with the house? Or with the pattern?" "The pattern," I said. Another pause. "I'd break it," she replied. That was it. Don't burn it down. Do not expose anyone publicly. Do not create a scene. Break the pattern. Patterns only survive with participation. And I had been participating for 38 years. The final confirmation came unexpectedly during a phone call with my mother 2 days later. She sounded tired. "Your father's worried you're pulling away," she said. "I am," I answered calmly. Silence. "Over money?" she asked, disbelief woven into the word. "No," I said, "over expectation." She didn't respond immediately. "We just thought," she began slowly, "that you would understand." There it was again. Understanding. The role. I inhaled carefully. Understanding doesn't mean agreeing. Her voice sharpened slightly for the first time in months. "Families make sacrifices." "Yes," I said, "but sacrifices are chosen, not assigned." The line went quiet. That was the moment I knew. Not because she yelled, not because she threatened, but because there was no curiosity in her response, no willingness to examine the imbalance. The only disappointment was that I wasn't fulfilling the role. The decision crystallized. I wasn't going to argue them into seeing me differently. I was going to behave differently. And behavior is harder to dismiss than words. That night, I finalized two decisions. First, I would not sell the house under pressure. Second, I would no longer engage in conversations that framed my stability as communal property. If that required distance, so be it. I drafted a message to the group chat and reread it several times before sending. I've made my decision. I will not be selling my home to divide the proceeds. I understand you may be disappointed. I am not open to further discussion about it. No insults, no accusations, no explanations, just closure. The responses arrived quickly. Daniel. So that's it. Lauren. I can't believe you'd choose money over family. Caleb. Wow. Dad. We need to talk about this in person. Mom. I don't understand how we got here. I placed my phone face down. For the first time, I didn't feel the urge to fix their reactions. Because the irreversible choice wasn't the refusal to sell. It was the refusal to continue negotiating my worth. Cutting off my family wasn't an explosive event. It was a boundary enforced consistently. And once you enforce a boundary calmly, without apology, something irreversible happens. The relationship either restructures or it fractures. I was prepared for a fracture because what they hadn't noticed, what they never noticed, was that I had already begun building a life that didn't depend on their approval. The decision point wasn't loud. It was simple. I chose myself, and I understood, with complete steadiness, that some choices close doors permanently. Once the message was sent, I didn't wait for the emotional aftershocks to settle. I moved, not physically, yet structurally. The first thing I did was adjust my accessibility. I muted the family group chat indefinitely, not out of anger, out of clarity. If I were no longer negotiating, I didn't need a live feed of their reactions. I let individual calls go to voicemail. I responded selectively, briefly, and only when necessary. No arguments, no long explanations. Thank you for your message. I'm not discussing this further. I copied and pasted that sentence more than once. Repetition builds reinforcement. Next, I informed my workplace that I was open to transfer opportunities. I didn't mention family. I framed it as career growth, which, in a way, it was. 2 weeks later, an opportunity surfaced in Denver. Same role, slightly higher salary, manageable relocation timeline. I didn't announce it. I accepted it, quietly. Then I began preparing the house. Not for sale, but for rental. This was the strategic pivot they never anticipated. If the house became an income producing asset, the narrative shifted. It was no longer unused space or sitting equity. It was business infrastructure. I consulted a property manager, reviewed lease agreements, calculated conservative rental estimates. The numbers worked, not extravagantly, not dramatically, but sustainably. If I relocated and rented the house out, I could cover the mortgage, property management fees, and still build equity long term. No redistribution, no liquidation, just repositioning. I remember sitting at my kitchen table, signing the property management contract, and feeling something steady and almost clinical. This wasn't revenge, it was insulation. Meanwhile, my family escalated their attempts to talk in person. Dad left a voicemail. This isn't how we handle things. I didn't call back. Lauren sent a long message about how hurt she was. I responded once. I care about you. My decision stands. Daniel tried logic again. Market timing, opportunity cost, big picture thinking. I replied, my financial decisions are not up for group discussion. The simplicity of that sentence felt almost foreign on my tongue, but once spoken, it held. A week later, I met with a relocation consultant through work. We discussed neighborhoods in Denver, temporary housing options, cost of living comparisons. I ran new spreadsheets. Projected rental income from Columbus. Projected rent in Denver. Emergency savings cushion. Exit strategy if needed. Every number is aligned, and with every aligned column, my internal certainty strengthened. The house was never the real issue. Control was, and I was reclaiming it methodically. Before listing the property for rent, I walked through each room slowly one evening. Not nostalgically, deliberately. I thanked the space in my own quiet way. For shelter, for proof, for growth. I wasn't abandoning it, I was transforming it. There's power in shifting something from an emotional symbol to a strategic asset. It removes vulnerability. When I finally informed my parents of the relocation, briefly, without detail, the reaction was immediate. You're leaving? My mother asked, her voice tight. Yes. For a job? Yes. And the house? I'm keeping it. A pause. What does that mean? My father asked. It means I'm not selling. The disappointment on the other end of the line was palpable. But beneath it, I sensed something else. Surprise. They had assumed resistance would be temporary. They hadn't anticipated decisive movement. That's the thing about quiet dominance. It doesn't argue, it acts. Within a month, my house was under lease to a young couple relocating for medical residencies. Responsible, verified income, 2-year contract, predictable cash flow. I packed my personal belongings carefully, leaving the house furnished minimally per the agreement. On my final night before flying to Denver, I stood in the empty living room and felt no bitterness, just alignment. I had not screamed, I had not insulted, I had not retaliated. I had simply declined participation and repositioned. The consequences hadn't fully surfaced yet, but I knew they would. Because when someone exits a system that relied on their compliance, the vacuum becomes visible. And I had just created one. Denver felt different the moment I arrived. Not in some cinematic reinvention kind of way. It was quieter than that. Cleaner air, wider streets, no history attached to the grocery stores, no childhood memories embedded in intersections. No one there knew I was the reasonable one. I was just Sadie, project coordinator, new hire transfer. A woman in her late 30s is renting a modest apartment near downtown. The absence of context was spacious. Back in Ohio, the consequences began surfacing almost immediately, but not in the way I expected. There were no dramatic confrontations, no furious ultimatums. Instead, there was confusion. Daniel texted first, "So you're really gone?" I replied, "Yes, the move is complete." No elaboration. Lauren called twice. I let it go to voicemail. Her message wasn't angry. It was unsettled. "I just don't understand why you'd go this far." That sentence revealed everything. To them, relocation was escalation. To me, it was alignment. Dad sent a longer email. He wrote about family unity, about how sudden decisions create fractures, about how I had always been the steady presence. He never mentioned the house directly. He didn't need to. What they were feeling wasn't just disappointment over money, it was destabilization. For years, I had been the constant, the fallback, the emotional shock absorber. Now that I was physically removed, the dynamics began shifting in visible ways. I heard through my mother, during one of our increasingly brief phone calls, that Daniel and Caleb had gotten into a heated argument about financial responsibility. Apparently, without my mediating presence at Sunday dinners, conversations spiraled faster. Lauren stopped attending family gatherings as frequently. She felt unsupported, she said. My parents sounded tired in a way that was different from before, not overwhelmed, unanchored. And I understood something quietly powerful. When you remove the person who absorbs tension, tension doesn't disappear. It redistributes. I didn't feel satisfied hearing about it. I felt confirmation. The imbalance they had wanted me to correct had never been about money. It was about emotional labor. I had been subsidizing peace. From Denver, my life felt increasingly simple. I went to work. I explored new neighborhoods on weekends. I hiked once with coworkers who didn't know my family history. I paid my bills. I watched the rental income steadily deposit into my account. No emergency calls, no strategic family meetings, just space. The distance clarified something else, too. No one asked how I was adjusting. Their messages focused on the move as a statement, not as a transition. You didn't have to leave, Caleb texted once. I stared at that sentence for a long time. I typed back, I did. He didn't respond. A month into my relocation, my mother finally said what had been hovering unspoken. It feels like you chose money over us. I didn't react defensively. I chose boundaries, I said calmly. Silence. You could have stayed and worked this out. I tried to work it out, I replied. Working it out would have required mutual understanding. Another silence. There was grief in her voice when she spoke again. I don't recognize you. That one hurt. Not because it was cruel, but because it was honest. They didn't recognize me because the version of me they knew was designed for their comfort. The consequences weren't explosive. They were gradual. Invitations stopped arriving automatically. Group photos were no longer shared. Conversations became logistical. The emotional intimacy thinned, and I let it. That was the part that surprised me most. I didn't chase repair. I didn't over explain. I didn't send long paragraphs, trying to translate myself into something more digestible. I allowed the distance to exist, because rebuilding a connection without restructuring expectations would only reset the pattern, and I wasn't going back. Months later, when the holiday season approached, my mother asked quietly, Are you coming home? Home. The word lingered in the air between us. I live in Denver now, I said gently. She exhaled slowly. The consequences had fully begun. Not dramatic estrangement, but recalibration. They were beginning to understand something fundamental. I wasn't negotiating. I had already moved. The panic didn't come all at once. It unfolded in stages. At first, my family treated my relocation like a phase, a dramatic overcorrection, something I would soften with time. They assumed distance would make me nostalgic. Those holidays would pull me back into orbit. But distance did something else instead. It stabilized me. 3 months after I moved to Denver, Daniel's business expansion failed. Investors pulled out. He called me, not to ask for money directly, but to talk through options. I listened. Old instincts stirred for a moment. The urge to analyze, to strategize, to steady the room. Instead, I said gently, I'm sure you'll figure out a solution. He was quiet. You always have ideas, he pressed. I'm focusing on my own transition right now, I replied. It wasn't cold. It was contained. After we hung up, I felt the familiar echo of guilt. But it didn't take root, because I understood something clearly now. My capacity to solve problems had never been neutral. It had been expected. Without my active participation, cracks became visible faster. Caleb moved back in with my parents temporarily. Lauren's financial situation tightened. Sunday dinners grew tense. According to my mother, the system was wobbling, and for the first time, I wasn't bracing to stabilize it. That's when the tone shifted from disappointment to urgency. Dad called one evening, his voice sharper than it had been in years. This isn't sustainable, he said. What isn't? I asked calmly. The distance, the silence, the way you've cut yourself off. I paused. I didn't cut myself off, I said evenly. I removed myself from a negotiation. He exhaled heavily. We never meant to push you away. I know. Then why go this far? Because halfway boundaries don't hold, I thought. Aloud, I said. Because staying would have meant agreeing. There was frustration in his silence. You're making this bigger than it needed to be. That sentence clarified everything. To them, This was about one decision: selling the house. To me, it had always been about precedent. If I had sold, the message would have been permanent. Sadie sacrifices, Sadie absorbs, Sadie adjusts, and once a precedent is set, it becomes tradition. A week later, my mother tried a different approach. "We don't care about the house anymore," she said softly. "We just want you back." I believed her. But I also recognized the timing. The pressure point had shifted. The house had been leveraged. Now my absence was. "I'm not gone," I replied. "I'm just living my life." "It feels like punishment," she whispered. That word lingered between us. Punishment implies intent to hurt. I wasn't trying to hurt them. I was protecting myself. And sometimes, protection looks like rejection from the outside. Over the next month, the calls grew more frequent. Invitations reappeared. Photos were sent again. Updates were shared as if nothing had fractured. But underneath the attempts at normalcy was something else: recognition. They had assumed I would bend. Now they were confronting the possibility that I wouldn't. Daniel eventually said it plainly during a short, strained call. "You've changed." "Yes," I answered. "Is there any way to fix this?" That question came too late. Not because reconciliation was impossible, but because fixing it would require something they still weren't offering: accountability, not for asking, but for assuming, for framing my autonomy as an imbalance, for equating fairness with the redistribution of what I built alone. Until that was acknowledged, repair would only be cosmetic. I didn't yell. I didn't accuse. I said something simple: "I'm open to a relationship that doesn't include expectation." He didn't respond immediately, because expectation had been woven into the fabric for so long that removing it felt like unraveling. The panic phase lasted a few weeks. Then it quieted. Not because everything was resolved, but because they began to understand something irreversible. I wasn't coming back to my old role. The house was never sold. The money was never divided. And the system they relied on, the quiet compliance, the steady redistribution, the emotional cushioning, was no longer available. It wasn't dramatic. It was final. And finally, once recognized, changes the tone of every future conversation. The confrontation, when it finally happened, wasn't explosive. It was quiet, scheduled, almost polite. 6 months after I moved to Denver, I agreed to meet my parents halfway in Kansas City. Neutral ground, a hotel lobby cafe with soft lighting and no history attached to the walls. When I walked in, they both stood. My mother hugged me longer than usual. My father's handshake turned into an awkward half embrace. There were no raised voices, just a heaviness that settled between us like something fragile. We ordered coffee. For a few minutes, we spoke about safe topics: my job, the weather, my rental tenants, their health. Then my father leaned forward slightly. "We need to understand what happened," he said. "Not why did you do this to us?" What happened? It was a better question. I took my time answering. "You began discussing my house as if it were a shared asset," I said calmly. And when I hesitated, the expectation intensified. My mother shook her head gently. "We were thinking about the family as a whole." "I know," I replied. "But no one asked whether I was willing." My father frowned slightly. "We assumed you would be." There it was. Assumption. Why? I asked. Not accusing, just curious. He hesitated. "Because you've always been steady, generous, the one who understands." "That's not consent," I said softly. The table went still. I wasn't angry. My voice didn't rise. I wasn't listing grievances from childhood. I was speaking about structure. "You raised me to be responsible," I continued. "I took that seriously. I built stability. But somewhere along the way, my stability became something you felt entitled to redistribute." My mother's eyes filled slightly, not with outrage, but with something closer to recognition. That wasn't our intention, she whispered. I believe you, I said. And I did. Intent and impact are not the same. My father's voice lost its firmness. We never wanted to lose you over this. You didn't lose me over money, I said. You lost access because I stopped agreeing. The honesty landed gently but firmly. For a long moment, none of us spoke. Finally, my mother asked, Is there a way back? It was the most vulnerable question of the afternoon. There's a way forward, I said. But it won't look like before. She nodded slowly. What does that mean? My father asked. It means my finances aren't for family discussions. It means I'm not the default solution. It means if I say no, it's respected the first time. He exhaled slowly. That feels distant. It's boundary, I corrected gently. There was no dramatic apology, no tearful reconciliation. But there was something important. Acknowledgement. For the first time, my father said the words directly. We shouldn't have assumed. Simple, clear, late, but real. I didn't rush to soften the moment. Because acknowledgement isn't the same as repair. Repair requires consistent change over time. We finished our coffee without revisiting the house again. The topic felt closed, not because it was avoided, but because it had been addressed directly. As we stood to leave, my mother touched my arm. You seem different, she said. I am, I answered. Harder, she added carefully. Stronger, I corrected. There was no heat in the conversation, no emotional explosion, just recalibration. They were seeing me without the role for the first time, not as the dependable buffer, not as the automatic solution, but as an autonomous adult with her own perimeter. When I walked back to my hotel room alone, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. Confrontation without heat is powerful because it leaves no spectacle to dismiss, no overreaction to blame, just truth delivered calmly. The dynamic had shifted permanently. Whether the relationship would survive that shift remained to be seen. But one thing was clear. I had not yelled to be heard. I had simply stopped bending, and that, more than anything, forced the conversation into clarity. It's been almost 2 years. The house in Ohio is still mine. The tenants renewed their lease. The mortgage balance continues to shrink each month quietly. It exists now not as an emotional battleground, but as what it always should have been: property. I still live in Denver. I hike more. I host small dinners with friends who know me as direct, not accommodating. At work, I was promoted last spring. Apparently, when you stop spending energy stabilizing other people's expectations, you have more focus left for yourself. My relationship with my family is different, measured. We speak occasionally: birthdays, major updates, short calls that stay within respectful boundaries. No one mentions the house anymore, not because it was forgotten, but because it was settled. The first holiday I didn't attend felt heavy. The second felt easier. The third felt neutral. Grief doesn't always come in waves of tears. Sometimes it arrives as quiet recognition that the version of closeness you had was conditional. And once conditions are removed, what remains is smaller, but more honest. I used to think cutting off my family meant dramatic finality: blocked numbers, burned bridges, public declarations. What it actually looked like was subtler. I cut off access to my compliance. I cut off participation in financial negotiations disguised as morality. I cut off the reflex to smooth, solve, and sacrifice automatically. In doing so, the relationships recalibrated around what was left. Some bonds thinned, some held, but none returned to the old pattern. And that's the real shift. People sometimes ask, carefully, if I regret it. If I regret not selling. If I regret relocating. If I regret creating distance. I think about that seriously each time. What I regret is how long I equated love with usefulness. What I regret is how easily I accepted praise for being low maintenance without questioning what that cost me. But the decision itself, no, because I didn't leave in anger. I left in clarity. There's a difference. Anger burns fast and loud. Clarity is quiet and permanent. I don't see my parents as villains. They were operating inside a system that rewarded my compliance. I had helped to build that system by never objecting. When I stopped, the structure shook. That doesn't make them evil, it makes the pattern visible. Today, when I hold the brass key to the Ohio house, now attached to a simpler keyring, I don't feel defensive. I feel grounded. The house represents effort, but the boundary represents identity. And identity is harder to rebuild than equity. If you had met me 3 years ago, you would have described me as accommodating, reliable, easygoing. Now, I'm still calm, still steady, but I'm not automatically available. I've learned that quiet doesn't mean passive, and strength isn't measured by how much you can carry for others. It's measured by what you refuse to carry anymore. The most surprising part of all this is that my life didn't implode after I chose myself. It expanded. Fewer voices, more clarity, less negotiation, more peace. I didn't become harder. I became defined. And definition, once claimed, doesn't fade easily. When I say I cut off my entire family, after my parents forced me to sell my only home to divide the money among my siblings, it sounds dramatic. But the truth is quieter than that. No one physically forced me. No one threatened me. No contracts were forged in secret. What happened was slower. Expectation was framed as fairness. Pressure was disguised as unity. Sacrifice was presented as proof of love. And for most of my life, I accepted that equation. When I was pressured to sell my only house for the sake of family fairness, I chose to walk away instead. Not because I valued money more than people, but because I finally understood that fairness without consent is coercion, no matter how gently it's delivered. Walking away didn't mean I stopped loving them. It meant I stopped negotiating my stability for approval. That's an uncomfortable truth, especially for those of us raised to believe that being the strong one means giving more, adjusting more, absorbing more. But strength without boundaries becomes depletion, and depletion eventually turns into resentment. I didn't want to resent my family, so I chose distance instead. There were no dramatic final words, no revenge, no public fallout, just a quiet shift. I stopped volunteering for what wasn't freely offered. I stopped explaining decisions that didn't require group approval. I stopped performing the role that kept everyone comfortable at my expense. And something surprising happened. The world didn't collapse. The sky didn't fall. I didn't become isolated or bitter. I became precise. Peace doesn't always arrive as reconciliation. Sometimes it arrives as clarity about where your responsibility ends. I learned that love and access are not the same thing. You can love people deeply and still restrict their influence over your life. You can wish them well and still decline participation in dynamics that erode you. You can be calm and still be immovable. If there's one thing I hope this story leaves you with, it's this. Fairness is not the redistribution of the most responsible person's effort. And being the strong one does not mean being the default solution. Sometimes the quietest act of dominance is simply saying no and meaning it. I'm curious. Have you ever been labeled the reliable one, the easy one, the strong one? And realized that title came with invisible expectations. What did you do when you finally saw the pattern? Let me know in the comments.
Cảm ơn các bạn vì đã theo dõi đến cuối. Đừng quên ấn like, share và bật chuông để không bỏ lỡ những video mới nhất nhé. Hẹn gặp lại.